Dealing with a flooded home is a huge, costly, and hazardous ordeal, yet it's also an opportunity to do more than just restore, but also make it better. There are many issues to deal with after a flood, from structural damage and contamination to also considering how deep was the water, is there power or not, and for how long were people kept away from their homes before you could return, and then of course just the stress and fatigue of dealing with the issues and the ordeal, and on top of that, the mold that's likely to be growing on most everything. Many hazards, from gas leaks and methane to concerns about bacteria, the chemicals that could have been in the floodwater and deposited on all the materials, and then you also need to be concerned about watching out for the vermin, the fire ants, the other kinds of pests that can be around. But even the cleanup process has its hazards in terms of exposure to the disinfectants. There could be carbon monoxide from using generators and other kinds of equipment. And then the deconstruction process may be uncovering and creating airborne lead-based paint, even asbestos, and finally potential exposure to mold, particularly when there are massive quantities to deal with. There are a lot of misconceptions and some myths out there that let me see if I can clarify some of the misconceptions that many people have. First of all is the term black mold. That is really a meaningless term. There are many types of mold or black, so just the color does not tell you exactly what it is. That is a term that came about by the media, talking about a particular type of mold that was in the media. That was covered a good bit due to some potential hazards with mycotoxins that were produced. But basically, testing to see whether or not it's a certain type of mold is not nearly as important as dealing with the problem and restoration remediation as quickly as possible. In general, if you can see it or you can smell it, it's there, and the most important thing is to deal with it as quickly as possible. Mildew versus mold. It's not that one is hazardous and one isn't. Mildew is really just a type of mold. It's a plant-based, grows on plant-based materials. They're just two terms for essentially the same thing. Some people, however, feel that if they have very heavy mold, that it's a total loss. The home needs to be demolished, and that is not the case. Mold grows on the surface of solid woods, but it does not penetrate. Decay fungi can cause wood to lose its structural integrity, but surface mold does not on solid wood materials. So in general, the structure is still okay if there are not other sources of damage to it. And though the cleanup process or remediation may be very difficult and expensive, the structure itself is probably not is not a loss because of the mold. Many people feel that bleach is a total cure, and though bleach is one type of disinfectant that can kill mold, it is not the total answer, and it is a hazard in and of itself. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. And then some people are under the misconception that they should not start the cleanup, the dry out, and the mold remediation process until after the insurance adjuster arrives, and that is false. As soon as it's clear to go in the building, that it's safe to go in the building, take pictures for the insurance adjuster, but begin the process as soon as possible. The longer the mold has time to grow, the worse the damage and the issue will be. First, let's talk about mold, because that is something that after a flood is the first thing that people need to grapple with how to handle. It is a tongue-in-cheek, a growing issue. Let's understand what molds are. Molds are part of nature. They're part of our environment. They're a type of fungi, and they're one of nature's ways to recycle materials, recycle natural materials. And so there are hundreds of types. There are types that tend to thrive outdoors and indoors as well. As they grow, they release tiny spores, and the spores travel in the air. You cannot see them. They settle on surfaces, and if the conditions are right, they can multiply and grow. Again, that happens all the time. The problem occurs when the colonies or the spore levels become large, particularly inside a home or a building. Once they start to grow, it's exponential, and that's why time is of the essence. The health hazards really are kind of a fuzzy science because there is not a clear dose response threshold as there could be for some other types of contaminants or poisons. It depends so much on the sensitivity of the individual. People with asthma and allergies will be more sensitive to most types of mold than others. Those with weakened immune systems, of course, the very young, the very old. And then another factor is the synergistic effect of mold exposure along with exposure to other types of hazards and contaminants, where you may not have a health effect with just one, but you put them together and you do. Of course, the type of mold makes a difference. Many types of mold can produce airborne toxins, but those vary as well. What is toxic mold? Well, that's another misnomer as well. Molds, some types of molds can produce mycotoxins, and that can become airborne. In some conditions, they might be carried in the spores, whether those spores are dead or alive. They can also be in the colony of the structure that is growing on a material. We can be affected by them, sometimes from skin contact, generally if we inhale or ingest. What are the health effects? Well, research has shown very clear effects in terms of allergic reactions. People who are allergic to mold components and spores will have what we normally think of as hay fever. It can trigger asthma attacks in folks who have that condition, and very heavy exposures can cause hypersensitivity pneumonitis. It's very rare, but some types can cause infectious diseases, particularly in people with weakened immune systems. But there are many potential health effects that in the literature, because everything is so variable in terms of exposure and sensitivity, there's not a clear causal relationship, not a strong enough relationship to be considered a cause and effect, but there are some associations and correlations with these types of potential effects with some types of molds and some types of mycotoxins. The mold, the celebrity mold that's been highlighted the most in the media is Stachybotrys. That is the one that the media is sometimes called black mold because it tends to be a slimy black mold that grows only on cellulose, very, very wet, saturated, long saturated cellulose, which would mean paper or wood. And it tends to be kind of slimy. The spores tend to hold together until they dry out, and then it is released. Stachybotrys is the celebrity mold. That's the one that was in the media quite a few years back because there was a possible association with infant deaths. It can produce a mycotoxin, which can have some serious health effects. But this is the type of mold that it only grows in really wet cellulose, wood or paper products that have been very wet for a long time, at least a week. and it does tend to be kind of slimy. And so the greatest hazard is really when it dries out and dies, because that's when the spores can be released. Penicillin. Yes, there are 150 species of it. It can cause allergic reactions. It can produce toxins as well. And it is also related to the penicillin that we use to help us heal when we have bacterial illnesses. And that's why anyone who's allergic to that kind of penicillin would likely have allergic reactions to the mold as well. Aspergillus and penicillin are both very common indoor molds that may be growing when mold gets out of hand indoors. And as you can see, I won't go into every single type, but there are many types, many other types. What's most important to know is the conditions for growth, because those are also the clues to control. Basically, to get a mold problem, there must be some present, but they're everywhere. It needs to be in a certain temperature range, which tends to be the same that we live in. There needs to be food, but that can be almost anything. Certain pH level, which is pretty much a pretty wide range of what we live in as well. And so the final condition for growth that is one that we actually have an opportunity to control is moisture. So the real key condition is moisture, and that is also the clue to control. So to control moisture, it's important that we understand a few basics about moisture and how it moves and how it transfers, so that we can be sure and get and keep everything dry. In the liquid form, water tends to flow downward, as you know, except when it doesn't. Wind, surface tension, wicking, all of this can bring moisture through materials to where it can move in opposite directions from downward. Humidity is important, both to understand how materials can get wet from condensation, as well as to understand how we can get everything to dry. Relative humidity is not just the amount of moisture in the air, but it's really the amount of water vapor in the air compared to, or relative to, the amount of water vapor the air can hold at that temperature. Here's where makes a difference important. You take a cube of air, and it's got a certain amount of moisture in it, and it's warm. Okay, at that temperature it can hold a lot of moisture, but you cool down that cube of air, and guess what? It can't hold that same amount of moisture anymore, so it will condense from gas to liquid. And that's why you get water on the outside of a glass of ice water. It's not coming through the glass from inside. It is because the warm, humid air touches that cold glass, and at that point, the air is cooled enough that moisture condenses. And so the key to drying is low relative humidity, and a high relative humidity and a cold surface add up to condensation. Through the drying process, to understand that and to be able to keep everything dry, it's helpful to understand that moisture, just the drive, the natural drive, is for moisture to move from a warm location to a colder location, and from where there's a lot of moisture to where there's less. It wants to equalize. Heat does the same thing, but so does moisture. So that will help us understand the direction of drying in certain climates and conditions. When it's hot outside and we air condition cool inside, the direction of drying is inward. In wintertime, it's the opposite. It's outward. So again, the key to mold control is moisture control. You want to try and get the relative humidity as low as possible, below 70% at the surfaces. Aim for lower than that, below 60, below 50. The moisture content of wood, which can be measured with a wood moisture meter, needs to be less than 16%, even less in in the engineered woods like chipboard, particle board, oriented strand board, even less in paper. It's okay for things to get wet if they can dry within 2 or 3 days. That is the window of time that it takes for mold to begin to grow into colonies. And so rapid drying is so very crucial and can prevent a mold population explosion. And then it's also important that the way the materials are put together allow draining, allow drying to the cooler, drier side. Now, once you have mold in a flooded home because you couldn't get back in and deal with it within those 3 days, you need to understand some guidelines, whether you hire someone else to do it or whether no one is available or you can't afford to hire a trained professional with special equipment, which is the safest way. But if you're a volunteer or you're a homeowner, basically here's some guidelines to understand, whoever does it, to be as safe and thorough as you can be. First of all, personal protection. Minimize exposure, particularly minimize what you inhale, how much is inhaled. At the very, very minimum, everyone around a moldy condition should wear a respirator rated at least N95. Higher the number, the better. It's not the same as a dust mask, not the same as a painting mask. It needs to be an N95 or better respirator. Unvented goggles, rubber gloves, and boots, but better yet is wearing full protection and half or full face respirators like the professionals do. And that's what's really needed to protect your health for bigger jobs. Keep in mind that if a home was built prior to 1978, it could contain lead-based paint. And so it is important to, before you start taking things apart or gutting or doing major cleanup, to check to see if that is a possibility and to get more information about it. And we don't have time today to go into all of the details, but essentially avoid any activity that creates dust, lead paint dust. Avoid scraping activities. Try to replace window trims that could have lead-based paint. Try to avoid spreading lead-based dust. Wet methods generally are preferable, wet and scraping methods, rather than avoid sanding, avoid torching, avoid the chemical paint removers. Back to dealing with the mold. Before cleaning up, try to isolate the space and draw air to the outdoors. Any kind of cleanup procedure, even if it's just wiping it down, can cause a release of the spores on the colony growing on that surface. So try to keep the spores from spreading to other areas, say the second floor of the home that is not moldy. Seal off the air conditioning vents, turn off the air system, your forced air system, your central air, seal off the vents, close the doors, or hang plastic in the stairway. Anything you can do to isolate the release of those spores. Put a fan in a window blowing toward the outdoors and open another window on the opposite side of the room or that area of the house. That will force the airborne spores. It will draw them to the outdoors rather than spreading to the rest of the house. and consider what is the source of the wetness that led to the mold. If it's floodwater, floodwater is considered contaminated. It could have anything in it. It could have chemicals. It's likely to have sewage and the bacteria associated with that. So if the flooding occurred because of a roof leak, that could be clean water. You wouldn't have to worry about that. But rising floodwater is generally considered contaminated. Remove and discard porous flooded materials, particularly anything that is padding, that is foamy. Always discard carpet padding, and normally, except for very valuable rugs, you can take someplace and have them clean and restored. Normally it's best to remove the carpeting as well. Upholstery, mattresses, those should be discarded. Fibrous insulations like fiberglass, cellulose, and open cell foams, those are not going to dry in time. They must be removed and discarded. Even if the water goes away, the walls look okay, the house looks okay, if you do not go in and remove that insulation, it will stay wet far too long and cause hidden problems in the walls. Particle boards, drywall sometimes can be salvaged if there's wet insulation behind it. If the mold is very heavy and eaten into the paper facing, then it should be removed and discarded as well. It's helpful, especially if the mold is very heavy, to minimize that massive release of spores. It can be very helpful to do things like encapsulate it first, cover it with a sheet of plastic, tape around the edges, cut around it, and then bag it all in heavy plastic garbage bags, and then tie them and seal them shut to be discarded, to try and capture as much of that moldy material and minimize the release as well. For the cleaning process, materials that can be cleaned successfully include solid woods, concrete, metal, hard plastics, drywall that's in good shape with no insulation behind it and where the mold has not been there too long, so it's just on the surface. We suggest using non-phosphate cleaners. The phosphate cleaners work really well, but if there's any phosphorus residue left after cleaning and rinsing, then that is food for mold, and it can stimulate or encourage growth of new mold if there's some wetness. It's best to clean first before going back with sanitizing, because if using bleach or some other types of disinfectants, but particularly bleach, the bleach can get spent on oxidizing basically the soil that is there, and then not have anything left to deal with killing the mold. And so if you need to sanitize because of potential contamination, then clean first and then come back and sanitize. There is some concern about whether to use bleach or not. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but essentially it's not essential, and bleach is a hazard in and of itself. So if it's a clean water that has caused wetness and mold, you can just clean. If there is sewage contamination, you must disinfect. But keep in mind, as I said before, disinfectants pose their own hazards. They kill. They are biocides, which means they are a toxic material in of themselves. Also, most of them, such as bleach, has no residual effect. It will be gone in 15-20 minutes, and it will not continue to do anything after that time. Can it kill mold? Yes, it can if it's exposed to it long enough. However, dead mold has the same health effects as live mold. So it is not an end-all cure and solution. the only thing that killing the mold does for you is it keeps it from reproducing, which is important, but it doesn't completely eliminate the hazard. So various kinds of efforts that just deal with killing mold but leave it in place can still be an issue for people, especially those who are sensitive, have extra sensitivities to it. How much to use? Well, again, it depends on the surface and the material, but generally about a half a cup to a cup of bleach per gallon of water will be a disinfecting level of solution. But it's best, especially with the new ultra bleach formulations, to follow the instructions for disinfecting solutions by the manufacturer of the product. Keep in mind, bleach is corrosive to metals, so do not use it on metals or anywhere in or near the air conditioning system. And also, it can damage fine woods. It can damage the color of materials that are not color fast. So be very selective if you do choose to use it. There are safer alternatives, though they're more expensive. The alcohols, hydrogen peroxide, there are phenolics, there are other products that are now available and on the market that work different ways to encapsulate and to structurally deter and deal with mold. Consider in the process after cleanup is using a penetrating borate spray on the wood while it's exposed if you have the walls gutted. That's an opportunity for the borate spray to provide some protection from decay, from termites. Termites are attracted to moisture, but it also is a deterrent to the regrowth of new mold while materials are drying out. It buys some time for that dry out period. If the people who live in the building or the home are vulnerable population, have special sensitivities or conditions, then you may want to take it a step further to really make sure you've removed as much of that mold as possible. Some people take it to the effect of they scrub down the wood studs, plus use a HEPA vacuum, which is a vacuum with a special, very, very fine filtration that will capture the microscopic spores. They may want to encapsulate the wood because of the grooves. You might not be able to get it all with a fungicide, but make sure that it is vapor permeable so moisture can still go through that fungicide or that encapsulate so the wood can still dry. Of course, the best option is always to hire a licensed or certified trained mold remediation contractor and who has specialized equipment and can do it to a greater degree and save the homeowner or the volunteer from the hazard and the exposure of dealing with cleaning up massive mold. Finally, people often say, I did all of this and it came back. Well, realize it's not the same mold coming back. It's new mold that is coming, that is starting to grow again when materials are wet for more than 3 days. So the key after cleanup is to speed the drying process. If you have electricity, if there is power, use air conditioning or run the heating system to help to dehumidify the air and that will help materials dry. If you can get your hands on a dehumidifier, a commercial one that you can rent or you buy dehumidifier to remove as much moisture from the air, that will help materials dry faster. If there is no power, then of course open windows and ventilate. But in a hot, humid southern climate in the middle of summer, that will be a very slow process. So generally, whereas in other types of year, other parts of the country, opening the windows and ventilating is recommended. In our climate, it's better to close up and air condition and dehumidify in those hot summer conditions. Do not restore, do not put insulation and your drywall back up. Do not restore until everything is dry enough. You want to check it with a moisture meter, make sure it's under 20% moisture content before you close everything up. Then remain on mold alert. Continue to dehumidify as much as you can. Check, inspect often. If you detect a musty odor, that means there are active colonies. There's active growth happening somewhere. And then you need to get your respirator back on and look for it. If regrowth occurs, or growth of new mold actually, then clean again, get a dehumidifier, or this time hire a professional. Now you've cleaned up the mold, you're ready to restore your home. What the message here that we'd like to consider is make your home even better as payback and as a return on your investment of dealing with the recovery of your flooded home. This can bring many returns on your investment. It can, if you make it to where your home is less vulnerable to damage, you can prevent the expense and the ordeal in the future. You can help to preserve your property value so it goes up instead of down. You can take this as an opportunity to improve the aesthetics, increase the value of your home, make it more durable, and perhaps you can also add in some features to improve its energy efficiency and have it become more comfortable and have lower utility bills so that you get some payback every month. First of all, though, consider restoring with materials that will not be damaged by the next flood, using damage and flood resistant materials. Consider using treated woods or composite materials that are water moisture resistant. There are lists on the FEMA website of flood resistant materials that you may want to take a look at. Consider using closed cell foam insulations, either rigid boards or the spray type. Consider paperless drywall. They do make drywall, your gypsum drywall now that instead of the paper facing has fiberglass matting. Consider acrylic latex paint and be sure it's got a mildewcide in it or an additive added to it that is more mold resistant. Solid flooring such as solid vinyl or clay tile or ceramic or porcelain tiles or brick floorings or even decorative concrete floorings that have no paper backings in them to be damaged. Fiberglass skin insulated doors and fiberglass or vinyl frame windows would not absorb moisture and be restored more easily. Okay, let's get into some more specifics. The flood hardy floorings. There are so many beautiful options out there that you can consider that can survive the flood and just be cleanable. Also consider opportunities if your flood level was low, say just a foot or less. Are there any appliances and equipment that can be elevated on platforms to be higher than that flood level so they would not be damaged and need to be replaced next time? In restoration, raise the electrical wiring and outlets if that needs to be redone. Great opportunity is the front-loading washer and dryer, which are also more energy efficient and use less water. Think about the components that go into a wall system, and you want to be sure that there is drainage space behind siding or your brick veneer or your cladding. That water that gets behind it can drain down and out, so it can dry readily as well. And house wraps or building paper needs to be shingle fashion. Everything needs to be installed properly shingle fashion so it can drain out and dry. If you want to take it a step further, and particularly in new construction, there is a concept called the flushable, drainable, dryable wall. And this model shows an example of how a wood frame home can be built or restored in such a way that there would be virtually no damage and it would be restorable without having to replace materials. In this model you see that there you can have a wainscoting, and it could be made out of various materials. It could be plywood, it could be fiber cement panels, and it could be removable. So after a flood it's removed, you drain, you clean, and you put it right back and not have to replace. Again, the paperless drywall, fiberglass matting instead of paper, that is a flood resistant material as established by FEMA testing, or by FEMA on the FEMA list. Wicking breaks. That is, you see where there's a gap behind that chair rail in the picture? If you have some gaps between your drywall, it prevents the wicking of moisture from one to the next, so it can confine the damage to the lower panel. Pop-off baseboards or removable baseboards and moldings, particularly if there's gaps behind them. That way you can remove them, you can flush out an empty wall cavity, and that can help ventilate and allow drying. In this particular model, there's closed cell rigid foam board on the outside of the studs, none in the stud cavities, none inside the wall. Or you can use closed cell spray foam inside the wall and just fill part of the cavity to allow drainability and rapid drying. Then on the outside there's fiber cement siding or brick veneer, again with drainage space behind it. Here are some schematic illustrations, the cross sections that show the assembly of that model that you just saw. This would allow venting and draining and the drying of the inside, where all the insulation's to the outside. Again, if you're having to do a major reconstruction or in new construction, this drainable, dryable wall assembly could survive a flood without needing to have anything but perhaps wiring replaced. Also take the opportunity in your restoration to make some upgrades to the energy efficiency of your home. This may be an opportunity if there's some damage. If you're replacing your air conditioner or your heating system because they were flooded, go with one that has a higher energy efficiency rating. Always look for Energy Star appliances. Consider adding more R value of insulation to your walls, raising the electric outlets, and replacing doors and windows with Energy Star rated for our climate zone. Be sure you look at the map and you choose the Energy Star rated products designed for our climate zone. On appliances and equipment, look for this yellow Energy Guide label. It reveals the hidden cost, the monthly energy cost of one model compared to the other. Generally, the extra cost of the more energy efficient model will be paid back to you many times over. And that Energy Star label, it is on many types of products these days, and it generally means that that product will be at least 20 or 30% more energy efficient than others on the market, and often a higher quality as well. So if you need to replace flooded or damaged outside unit of your air conditioner or heat pump, consider replacing not inside and outside unit together, and again look for the Energy Star label. Get units that are matched but with a higher efficiency rating. With air conditioning, that's SEER. On the heat side of a heat pump, HSPF. But what is Energy Star will be cost effective. If you need to replace a gas furnace for some reason it was damaged too, in the deep south, sometimes it's hard to justify 90% efficiency because the winters are short and mild. Something in mid efficiency can suffice. But regardless of the system, be sure that it's correctly sized, particularly if you're making other energy improvements. One of the worst things you can do is oversize the air conditioning system. It will not dehumidify as well. It'll cost more to start out with. It will be less energy efficient in month to month, and it won't last as long. So it's a loser in every way. And along with that, making sure that the connections to the ductwork and the ductwork is well sealed and airtight, better yet, get it tested, is another way to ensure that you will actually get the cooling and heating where you want it, when you want it, and to get what you pay for without trying to heat and cool the great outdoors or your attic. If the walls have been gutted, consider this an opportunity to increase the R value in the walls with closed cell spray foam, which is also flood hardy, or closed cell rigid foam board. They can be cut and fit or ordered to fit in between the studs as well. Insulated doors have foam insulation in the core of them. The fiberglass skin is very durable and non-absorbent. And fiberglass and vinyl frame windows also are very energy efficient with an Energy Star label. Look if you're having to replace electrical wiring and outlet boxes. There are types that have gaskets in them that create a more airtight seal. And be sure to get your house air sealed in the restoration process. Use foam sealants, taped wraps, methods to stop the air leakage through walls and between the inside space and the attic and the space below your home as well. After Hurricane Katrina, these organizations teamed up to create these two prototype homes in New Orleans for low-income families whose homes were destroyed. And I like to call these wash and wear houses because they would survive another Katrina. They were not only flood hardy, also wind resistant, termite resistant, and highly energy efficient and durable. So just as a bit of a preview about them, because it reviews some of the concepts we've been talking about, if in a potential uncertain flood condition like New Orleans, consider the concepts of using all flood hardy materials in that lower level. One of the houses used closed cell spray foam inside the wall cavities, partial fill, so there's still drainability and dryability of the studs. The other house uses rigid foam board all outside the studs, so there's nothing between them. The subfloor insulation systems were flood hardy. One was fire rated rigid foam board that encapsulate the floor joists, taped and sealed. The other one is closed cell spray foam between the floor joists. The walls had all flood hardy materials as well. On the inside was paperless drywall. On the outside, furring strips to create a drainage space, and then fiber cement siding and trim, all flood hardy. No matter how you are able to restore your home and get as many of these benefits as possible. A lot of resources are available to help you with this process, including EPA.gov has flood cleanup, brochures, materials, posters in different languages. They are also, their websites have a lot of free information dealing with how to deal with lead as well as mold, and many publications are downloadable. Be familiar also with the National Center for Healthy Housing. They have some materials that they created post-Katrina, but they also are a source of research and training for professionals in a variety of topics, and they have training partners throughout the country. Eden is the Extension Disaster Education Network. This website is a collection of educational resources and information from every state of the country, extension materials, lessons, programs, FAQs, and many different avenues and resources and contacts in the various states to deal with all kinds of disasters. eextension.org is a nationwide website that taps the expertise of extension all over the country on many topics, and one of the segments of it deals with home energy. So check that out as well. The LSU Ag Center, Louisiana Cooperative Extension Service, also has a variety of materials relating with flood cleanup and flood restoration and mold on our website as well, lsuagcenter.com/home. You can find our mold removal guidelines for your flooded home, as well as a variety of other materials, including the more comprehensive storm recovery guide and particulars about insulating raised floors. Do check out the website of La House Resource Center. On this website, you can find out about La House itself, which is an educational demonstration home and a permanent facility that shows 4 different high-performance building systems. But there's also My House segment, which takes you to a great deal of information on creating a high-performance home. If you ever have the opportunity to come to Baton Rouge, the LSU campus, be sure to visit La House. It is open Monday through Friday from 10 to 4:30, except for holidays, and it is open for self-guided tours, as well as a resource room and an exhibit room and lots of educational materials. It uses 4 different high-performance building systems and a variety of materials and equipment that illustrate high-performance features both in terms of hazard resistance, energy efficiency, healthy home, green building, even universal design. Thank you for your attention and your time today, and best wishes to you in dealing with your current or future flooded home.